Who sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt? Was it Ishmaelites or was it Midianites? And if you're thinking, haha, Ishmaelites were Midianites. No, they weren't. That's just putting dogma over data. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and I want to talk about a contradiction that we find in Genesis 37, verses 18 through 36, and then in Genesis 39:1. And I want to talk about how this contradiction has helped scholars to disentangle the two originally distinct and very different versions of the story of Joseph being sold into Egypt. And the main contradiction is between verses 28 and 36 and then Genesis 39:1. In verse 28, it says that Midianites sold Joseph to Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. But in verse 36, it says that Midianites sold Joseph to Potiphar in Egypt. But then if we go to Genesis 39:1, it says that Ishmaelites sold Joseph to Potiphar in Egypt. And while this is the main contradiction, there are a lot of other inconsistencies that make us wonder what on earth is going on here. So here's the text of Genesis 37:18 through 36. And I want to real briefly summarize what's going on here. We start with the statement that his brothers conspired to kill him. Then we have a separate description of his brothers conspiring to kill him. Great. They're going to throw him in a pit. And then Reuben says, wait a minute, what if we didn't kill him? Let's just throw him in the pit. So they do that, and then they sit down to eat. And then Judah says, wait a minute, what if we didn't kill him? What if we sold him to Ishmaelites? But verse 28 says that Midianite traders passed by, drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites, and they took Joseph to Egypt. And then Reuben comes back to the pit to see that Joseph's not there because evidently Reuben has run off for some reason. The narrative doesn't tell us this, but Reuben is not aware that they have sold Joseph. Reuben doesn't know what's going on. And so the brothers now take Joseph's robe, slaughter a goat, dip the robe in blood, and take that back to his father, evidently not bothering to tell Reuben what actually happened. And then we have the statement that Midianites sold Joseph to Potiphar in Egypt. And then we go to Genesis 39:1, where Ishmaelites sold Joseph to Potiphar in Egypt. Now, I want to share the text again. Here it is again, but I've highlighted some text in red. And the reason is because these are things that seem to conflict internally within the narrative. And if we separate these red and black texts out, we actually get two perfectly coherent and consistent versions of the story with their own beginnings, middles, and ends. So let's take a look at the two different stories. According to one, it starts in verse 18. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. Reuben said to them, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father. And they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where can I turn? Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So here the statement that they sat down to eat is where we get their separation from the pit and the fact that they don't know what's going on at the pit when the Midianites come by and take him out of the pit and take him to Egypt. So Reuben comes back to the pit. Joseph's not there. Reuben then returns to his brothers, who are still probably sitting down eating. So that is one perfectly consistent, coherent story. The beginning, the middle, the end, it's all there. All the details fit. And then we have a separate story. That begins in verse 19. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the ornamented robe taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Now this fits with Genesis 39:1 because it says the Ishmaelites took him to Egypt, but then in Genesis 39:1 it says the Ishmaelites sold him to Potiphar in Egypt. So this carries on the narrative in Genesis 39:1. The other story with the Midianites is a shorter, probably earlier, distinct one that was probably woven together with this other one at some point in the editing of the larger narrative of Joseph's life. Now, some folks will insist that Midianites were Ishmaelites, and this is usually based on an appeal to a passage in Judges 8:24, where Gideon creates this ephod and requests gold from the soldiers who have just destroyed a bunch of Midianites. And there's a parenthetical statement that most critical scholars agree is a secondary addition to the text that says, because they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And so the idea is, oh, this means Ishmaelites are Midianites. But this identification doesn't really make sense of the way Ishmaelites or Midianites are discussed throughout the Bible, much less of their genealogy as it is found in the Bible. So no, Ishmaelites were not Midianites. At best, an editor of Judges 8 is trying to identify Ishmaelites as among the Midianites that were just being conquered, as if this was some kind of confederation of tribes. But the data don't support the notion that Midianites were Ishmaelites, Ishmaelites were Midianites. And it particularly doesn't support the notion in light of the fact that in our story, we have to imagine this author is just toggling back and forth within individual sentences between identifying them as Midianites and Ishmaelites. And if we needed that parenthetical in Judges 8:24, why wouldn't we need it in this earlier passage where nobody understands, ostensibly, that Midianites are Ishmaelites? It doesn't make sense. And when we look in verse 28, it says that the Midianites sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. So they're not the same group. And some folks will insist that it was the brothers who sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, not the Midianites, but that does not make sense of the Hebrew. And again, it requires that we imagine one sentence to be referring to the same group as Midianites in one clause and Ishmaelites in another clause. But the antecedent of these verbs that don't have any subject, they drew him, they lifted him up, they sold him to Ishmaelites, would have to be the Midianites. And once we tease apart these narrative inconsistencies, we get two perfectly consistent, perfectly coherent, and perfectly complete stories. By far, the most likely conclusion is that the story as we have it now in Genesis 37 and then in Genesis 39:1 is the product of a weaving together of two originally different stories. And this is something that happens. Sometimes they put one story right after the other. Sometimes they weave them together. Sometimes they pick some of the details out of one and put it within the other. This is just some of the editorial practices that the editors and the redactors of the biblical texts used. So this is most likely a contradiction that is the result of a somewhat sloppy weaving together of two originally distinct and different versions of the one story of Joseph being sold into Egypt. And the inconsistencies help us perform a little source criticism and discover what these two different versions of the story originally said. And the fit for this video has been Daredevil and the Punisher.